Welcome to Indonesia Political Focus. I'm your host, and today we're examining the key political developments across Indonesia during May 2025. This month has been marked by President Prabowo Subianto's landmark May Day labor commitments and significant international diplomacy, including state visits from French President Emmanuel Macron and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. While domestic challenges persisted with ongoing protests and escalating violence in West Papua. Today we'll be covering Prabowo's labor reform initiatives, analyzing the administration's international positioning, examining the continuing civil society resistance, and exploring the concerning developments in West Papua that have drawn international human rights scrutiny. May 2025 presented a month of contrasts for Indonesia's political landscape, showcasing both diplomatic achievements and persistent domestic tensions. The month was dominated by President Prabowo's efforts to position himself as a champion of workers' rights through his May Day speech, while simultaneously managing ongoing protests against the TNI law revision that have continued since February. The administration demonstrated significant diplomatic momentum with high-profile visits from French President Emmanuel Macron, marking 75 years of Indonesia-France relations, and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who declared Indonesia as Australia's most important relationship. These engagements reinforced Indonesia's growing international stature under Prabowo's leadership. However, domestic challenges intensified with escalating violence in West Papua, where military operations resulted in civilian casualties and displacement of thousands of indigenous Papuans. Human Rights Watch documented concerning developments that have drawn international scrutiny to Indonesia's handling of regional conflicts. The month also revealed ongoing power dynamics within the administration, with former President Jokowi's influence continuing to create internal tensions, while civil society maintained pressure through sustained protests and activism across multiple issues. President Prabowo's most significant policy announcement came during his May Day speech at the National Monument, where he pledged comprehensive labor reforms and announced the establishment of a National Workers' Welfare Council. This council, comprising labor union leaders and public figures, will evaluate existing labor regulations and recommend reforms, with an initial focus on gradually eliminating outsourcing practices that undermine job security and worker benefits. The administration continued addressing economic challenges following Q1 2025 GDP growth of 4.87%, the slowest pace since 2021. In response, the government introduced new economic strategies including expansion of the free nutritious meal program, targeted social assistance for vulnerable groups, public transportation discounts, electricity subsidies, and deregulation to simplify business permits. However, the free nutritious meal program faced significant criticism, with reports highlighting losses experienced by beneficiaries and partners due to unprepared policy design and weak implementation. This has become a focal point for ongoing protests and civil society criticism. The Ministry of National Development Planning began preparing Indonesia's 2025 Voluntary National Review on Sustainable Development Goals, themed Fostering Inclusive Growth, Advancing a Sustainable and Resilient Indonesia, focusing on health, gender equality, decent work, marine life, and partnerships. Bank Indonesia lowered its benchmark rate to 5.5% in May to stimulate domestic demand amid sluggish economic growth, reflecting the administration's efforts to balance fiscal discipline with growth objectives. The labor movement revealed significant divisions in Indonesia's political landscape during May. Two distinct May Day events in Jakarta highlighted this split. One at the National Monument, attended by President Prabowo, and state officials appeared state-aligned, while another protest outside the DPR building maintained an oppositional character. This division reflects broader tensions between state-aligned and opposition labor organizations. The MONA's event was facilitated by an alliance of 4 major trade union confederations, with KSPI President Said Iqbal prominent, alongside President Prabowo, suggesting efforts by the administration to engage with and potentially co-opt significant segments of the labor movement, while other factions maintained confrontational stances. Former President Jokowi's lingering influence continued to create internal dynamics within the cabinet, with several ministers reportedly maintaining loyalties to the former president. This ongoing challenge to Prabowo's authority consolidation was evident in the administration's need to navigate complex coalition politics while implementing controversial policies. The Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle, PDIP, continued facing scrutiny over corruption allegations, further weakening its influence as a traditional powerhouse. Meanwhile, debates over the expansion of new autonomous regions highlighted tensions between central and regional authorities regarding fiscal resources and political control. The administration's relationship with civil society organizations remained strained, as evidenced by the arrest of student protesters in Semarang following May Day demonstrations, suggesting a narrowing space for dissent and criticism. Public engagement remained robust throughout May, primarily centered on labor rights and ongoing resistance to the TNI law revision. International Workers' Day saw significant demonstrations in Jakarta, with groups like JEBRAK, People's United Labor Movement, advocating for stronger workers' rights, welfare guarantees, and non-discriminatory policies. The Advocacy Team for Democracy reported repressive and arbitrary actions by police forces against demonstrators, including blocking and searching protesters, and making accusations without clear evidence. 6 suspects, including 5 university students, were named following chaotic May Day protests in Semarang, raising concerns about shrinking civic space and freedom of expression. The anti-government demonstrations that began in February continued under the Indonesia Jelap and /Talak Rutni movements, maintaining momentum despite government pressure. Student unions, labor coalitions, and grassroots organizations played leading roles in articulating demands for the repeal of controversial laws and protection of civil liberties. Social media campaigns continued to amplify opposition voices, with hashtags like /Indonesia Jelap trending as expressions of widespread public discontent with perceived authoritarian tendencies and policy failures. Civil society actors also responded critically to the government's handling of the free nutritious meal program, calling for greater transparency, accountability, and participatory policymaking in response to reports of implementation failures and negative impacts on intended beneficiaries. The most serious regional challenge emerged from escalating violence in West Papua, where fighting between Indonesian security forces and Papuan separatist groups intensified following attacks on alleged miners in April. Military operations in the Central Highlands resulted in civilian casualties from drone strikes and indiscriminate use of explosive munitions, displacing thousands of indigenous Papuans. Human Rights Watch documented concerning developments as Operation Habma expanded across West Papua's 6 provinces, with officials claiming to have killed 18 separatist fighters in Intan Jaya Regency on May 14. This escalation has drawn international attention and criticism regarding proportionality and civilian protection. The ongoing debate over the expansion of new autonomous regions continued, with analysts warning that expansion must be guided by genuine regional needs and fiscal capacity rather than political expediency. The government's cautious approach reflects concerns about budgetary strain and potential undermining of national cohesion. Regional responses to presidential initiatives varied across Indonesia's diverse provinces, with some local governments supporting expanded social assistance, while others expressed skepticism about policy effectiveness. The administration's ability to balance central authority with regional aspirations remains crucial for maintaining national cohesion. Indonesia's participation in the 46th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur demonstrated its continued regional leadership, with President Prabowo advocating for enhanced ASEAN-GCC economic cooperation and migrant worker protection, positioning Indonesia as a bridge between different regional blocs. The intersection of economic and political factors was particularly evident in the government's response to slowing GDP growth. The expansion of social assistance programs and fiscal stimulus measures were politically significant as they aimed to address public welfare concerns while stimulating economic demand amid challenging conditions. President Prabowo's labor reform commitments directly addressed economic pressures on Indonesian workers, demonstrating a political response to concerns about job security, wages, and working conditions. However, the division within labor movements between state-aligned and opposition factions reflected deeper tensions about economic development models and worker protection strategies. The free nutritious meal program's implementation challenges highlighted how policy failures can become significant political issues. Critical analysis pointing to negative impacts on beneficiaries created political pressure on the administration and fueled ongoing protests. International economic agreements, signed during high-level diplomatic visits, demonstrated how diplomatic relationships translate into economic opportunities. The France-Indonesia cooperation on critical minerals positioned Indonesia to benefit from global energy transition investments while developing domestic processing capabilities. The situation in West Papua also carried economic implications, as military operations disrupted local economic activities and raised concerns about investment climate and resource extraction in the region. The government's security-first approach reflected prioritization of territorial integrity over immediate economic considerations. Looking toward June and beyond, several critical issues will likely shape Indonesia's political trajectory. The implementation of labor reforms through the National Workers' Welfare Council will be closely watched as a test of the administration's commitment to social welfare and democratic governance. The success or failure of this initiative in addressing worker grievances will significantly influence public support and labor relations stability. The escalating violence in West Papua represents the most serious immediate challenge, with Human Rights Watch's documentation of civilian casualties creating pressure for policy changes and international scrutiny. The government's military-first approach may face increasing criticism from human rights organizations and international partners. International economic partnerships established through recent diplomatic visits will require careful implementation to deliver promised benefits. The critical minerals cooperation with France and enhanced strategic partnership with Australia will be tested through practical cooperation on regional security and economic challenges. The administration's approach to civil society and democratic space will face continued scrutiny, particularly following the arrest of student protesters and ongoing restrictions on political expression. The balance between maintaining security and preserving democratic freedoms will be crucial for long-term political stability. The ongoing implementation of economic policies to counter the Q1 slowdown will remain a central focus, with the success of fiscal and structural measures being critical for maintaining public confidence and economic stability. May 2025 has demonstrated President Prabowo's administration navigating between significant diplomatic achievements and persistent domestic challenges. While international engagements with France and Australia elevated Indonesia's global profile, domestic issues including labor unrest, civil society resistance, and the West Papua crisis continue to test the government's governance capacity. The establishment of the National Workers' Welfare Council represents a potentially significant step toward addressing labor concerns, but implementation will be crucial. The administration's handling of ongoing protests and civil society demands will be a key test of its commitment to democratic accountability. As we monitor these developments, critical questions emerge. Can the administration successfully balance its international ambitions with domestic stability? Will the labor reforms deliver meaningful improvements for Indonesian workers? And how will the government address the growing international scrutiny over West Papua while maintaining territorial integrity? This has been Indonesia Political Focus for May 2025. Thank you for listening.